At 90, she falls in love with a 25-year-old man. An incredible secret revealed in Carmel by the Sea, a town built on art and secrets. Clara Hawthorne, at 90, was local royalty. A widow who lived her days in a quiet routine, punctuated only by the tides and the care of her prized roses. Her life was an elegant book, read and reread, kept on a shelf. Her feelings, she thought, were like the yellowed letters in her attic, precious, but belonging to a dusty past. And then, Hurricane Adam hit. He didn't arrive quietly. He arrived in a creaky old van, with electronic music loud enough to rattle Clara's porcelain windows. Adam, 25, an artist with perpetually messy hair and paint smears on his face, moved into the abandoned house next door, turning the garden into an outdoor studio. To anyone else, he would be a nuisance. To Clara, he was a burst of color in her sepia-toned world. The attraction she felt was immediate, magnetic, and profoundly inexplicable. Their first interaction was almost a cliché, a scene the town of Carmel itself would love to depict in one of its upscale galleries. Clara, on one of her rare trips to the local market, let her bag of oranges rip, and the fruit tumbled onto the cobblestone sidewalk. Adam, who was across the street sketching the architecture, dropped his notebook and rushed to help her. He collected each fruit with a genuine smile, his voice warm and carefree as he joked about the runaway oranges. And in that moment, as their fingers touched as they picked up the last fruit, something happened. It wasn't an electric shock, but something much deeper. A strange and intensely familiar sensation, like a forgotten melody from his youth. From that day on, Clara's 90-year routine, once predictable as the tides of the Pacific, fell apart completely. She began to invent small, almost transparent excuses. She showed up at his chaotic door with a slice of her famous apple pie, claiming she'd made too much and didn't want to spoil it. She asked for help reaching a book on the top shelf of her library, even though her oak stool, used for that purpose for 30 years, was perfectly accessible nearby. Every brief conversation they had at the garden gate was like a balm. He listened to her. He really listened, asking questions about old Carmel with an interest that his own grandchildren, distant and busy, rarely showed. But at night, alone in her velvet armchair, Clara felt completely disoriented. This strange warmth in her chest, this stupid, accelerated heartbeat whenever she heard the sound of his old van pulling up. It was ridiculous. These were the feelings of a teenager, not a woman on the verge of her centenary. She tried to rationalize, scolding herself. It's just loneliness, she told herself. The simple joy of having a kind neighbor after so many years alone. But deep down, she knew it was deeper. There was recognition in those eyes, a connection that transcended logic, age, and common sense. What Clara didn't know was that the fascination was mutual, though he believed it to be of a different nature. Adam was a portraitist, but he was bored of painting the smooth, empty faces of his contemporaries. And in Clara's face, he saw landscapes. He saw the map of an entire life. Every wrinkle around her eyes was a path traveled. Every blemish on her skin was a story of sun and time. He felt an almost compulsive need to capture that essence. One day, he summoned the courage and knocked on her door, not with an excuse, but with his sketchbook in hand. "Mrs. Hawthorne," he began nervously. "I know this may sound strange, but I would be incredibly honored if you would allow me to paint your portrait. I don't want to paint just your face. I want to paint your story." Painting sessions became their daily ritual. Clara's house, once a quiet sanctuary of memories, was now filled with the rich, earthy smell of turpentine and Adam's paint, and the sound of Adam's low voice reading poetry or talking philosophy as he worked. They were creating art. They were forging an unlikely friendship. But the small, close-knit community of Carmel, a town that thrives on both scenic beauty and vicious gossip, saw something very, very different. The trial began at the local market and spread like wildfire through the dry coastal grass. Neighbors, walking their dogs, looked through Clara's large living room window. They didn't see an artist and his muse. They saw a vibrant young man in his early 20s leaning over the frail 90-year-old woman in her armchair. They saw Adam gently touch her chin, and in their minds, it wasn't a professional adjustment to capture the light, but an intimate caress. They heard her laughter, a sound not heard on those streets for decades, and interpreted it not as joy, but as the babble of a senile woman being enchanted. They saw the house lights burning late, heard his electronic music mixed with her classical, and the city's sordid imagination filled in the gaps. The narrative was complete. "He's been there for hours every day," they whispered in the cafe. "Did she give him a key to the house? It's obvious what he wants. He's a con man, a profiteer. He's waiting for her to die so he can take that $1 million house and her famous husband's royalties." What was a deep intellectual connection, a collision of souls, was twisted, repackaged, and sold as the season's most sordid scandal. The hint of sensuality wasn't in the house. It was entirely in the town's perverse mind. They didn't see an artist. They saw a predator. They didn't see a woman being truly seen for the first time in 50 years. They saw a foolish, lonely old woman, blinded by the last pathetic spark of desire, being shamefully seduced into handing over her inheritance. Clara, already struggling with the confusion of her own unexplained feelings, now found herself at the center of a cruel public trial, unaware that the truth of their connection ran far deeper than she, or the town, could begin to imagine. Adam's studio was a glorious chaos, a perfect reflection of his vibrant mind. Canvases of all sizes were stacked haphazardly against the walls, some bursting with abstract colors, others just charcoal sketches. The air was thick, almost suffocating, with the strong smell of turpentine, Adam's paint, and the faint, salty scent of the Pacific drifting in through the open window. For Clara, entering that space was like entering another world, a world of raw, creative energy she hadn't felt in half a century. And there, positioned in the best light, at the center of it all, was her portrait. She stopped, her breath catching in her throat. He had captured her. But he hadn't just painted the 90-year-old widow the town saw. He hadn't painted the frail recluse. Somehow he had pierced the layers of time. The eyes on the canvas. They were hers, unmistakably. But they held a spark, a story of defiance and passion she'd thought buried for decades. Adam stood back nervously, wiping his perpetually paint-stained hands on a dirty rag. I don't know if I did it," he muttered, his usual confidence fading. "It was the hardest thing I've ever painted." Clara turned to him, genuinely confused. "Hard? But you're so talented, so fast." Adam shook his head, struggling for words, looking almost embarrassed. "No, Mrs. Hawthorne. Clara, it was difficult because I felt like I already knew you." Silence fell between them, thicker than the smell of paint. "As I painted," he continued, his voice low and serious, "especially your eyes, and the way your smile forms before you actually smile. I had this overwhelming feeling of déjà vu. Like I'd painted that face before, like I—" He stopped, shaking his head. "It sounds crazy." "No," Clara said, her voice barely audible. "It doesn't seem crazy." That inexplicable recognition she felt for him, that magnetic force that frightened her. He felt it too. His confession validated her confusion. The town's sordid gossip seemed even more pathetic, even further from the truth. They were sharing something no one else could begin to understand. She turned back to the portrait, marveling at the depth he had found within it. But as she gazed at her own face on the canvas, her eyes were drawn to the jumble of art supplies beneath Adam's work table. Amid the tins of brushes and crushed tubes of paint, there was something that didn't belong. An old dark wooden box, weathered with age, with a faded military eagle engraved on the lid. She pointed. "What is this, Adam?" "It's certainly not art supplies." Adam looked down, his tone instantly changing from introspective to casual, almost dismissive. "Oh, this? This is old junk. It's my grandfather's stuff," he explained with a shrug. "The one I never knew, the supposed war hero. My mother kept it all, but to me, they're just ghosts. I don't even know why I brought this here. Ghosts." The word hung in the air, charged. Clara felt that magnetic pull again, but this time it wasn't directed at Adam. It was at the box. The mention of war, an era she'd briefly discussed during their sessions, combined with the sense of déjà vu he'd just admitted. A cold, urgent curiosity gripped her. She moved toward the table. "May I?" "Sure," Adam said, looking confused by her sudden interest. "But there's nothing there but dust and metals." With a trembling hand, a hand scarred by 90 years of living, She touched the worn wood of the box. It was open, revealing a tangle of ribbon-tied letters, a Purple Heart medal, and, at the very top, a single sepia photograph, protected by cracked yellowed plastic. She took the photograph. The studio seemed to disappear. The sound of the waves outside, the smell of paint, Adam's presence, everything dissolved. There was only the face in the photograph, a studio portrait of a young soldier in World War II uniform, a bold, almost arrogant smile, and eyes that shone with life, defiance, and promise. Clara let out a gasp, a sharp, strangled sound, as if the air had been stolen from her lungs. The photograph fell from her trembling fingers, fluttering to the dusty floor. She clutched her chest, her face, which had been a moment ago alight with admiration for her portrait, now a mask of blank shock and utter disbelief. She glanced at Adam, who rushed to her side, his expression of artistic concern now transformed into genuine panic. And then she looked back at the photograph on the floor. It was the same face, the same smile, the same eyes. 70 years of mourning, 70 years of silence, 70 years of acceptance. Everything evaporated in that instant. The young war hero, the 25-year-old painter, they were the same face. "Clara, what is it?" "Mrs. Hawthorne, are you okay?" Adam's voice was filled with panic, piercing the silence of the studio. He rushed to her side, grabbing her arm to steady her, genuinely startled by her sudden, violent reaction. But she didn't hear him. She didn't even seem to feel his touch. Her eyes, which had been shining with admiration for the portrait a moment ago, were now fixed on the sepia photograph lying on the dusty floor. Her face, usually a serene landscape of wrinkles, was distorted by an emotion so raw, so vivid, and so powerful that it startled him. She was no longer in California in 2025. She was somewhere else, in another time. She pointed. Her finger, gnarled with age, trembled uncontrollably. "Him," she whispered, her voice so fragile it was almost lost in the distant sound of the waves. "Who is he?" Adam picked up the photograph, brushing the dust off it, completely confused. He looked from the young face in the photo to Clara's pale one. "That's my grandfather," he replied, his voice cautious. His name was Thomas. It was the name that broke her. Thomas. She squeezed her eyes shut, as if the name were a light too bright to bear, and a single tear escaped, tracing a slow path down her wrinkled cheek. "Thomas," she repeated. It wasn't a question. It was a lament, a long-forgotten prayer. And then she looked at Adam. But she wasn't seeing the 25-year-old painter. Her eyes were unfocused, staring right through him, seeing a ghost. In that moment, she wasn't a frail 90-year-old woman. She was a young woman of 20, reliving the most acute pain of her life. And the story came. A flood. A torrent of memories held under pressure for 70 years, now released by the sight of that face. She spoke, her voice no longer fragile but strong, charged with the clarity of trauma. She spoke of a time when Carmel by the Sea was not a playground for wealthy tourists, but a tense, darkened military outpost during World War II. She was a young local volunteer, serving coffee and hope to soldiers at the USO station. Thomas, she explained, was a young radio specialist fresh from a farm in Ohio, assigned to the coastal listening station, watching the Pacific for enemy submarines. Their first meeting wasn't in an art studio, but on a misty beach during a dawn patrol. Their eyes met in the mist, and in that instant, amid the constant fear of war, they recognized each other. Their love blossomed in absolute secrecy, in stolen moments. Hasty meetings behind the dance hall, walks along secluded coves at sunset, sharing dreams of a future that seemed impossible. They planned it all. When the war ended, he wouldn't return to Ohio. He would stay. They would build a small house on those same cliffs, overlooking the ocean, and she would plant a rose garden. "I will come back to you, Clara," she whispered, reciting his promise as if it were a sacred vow. "He told me at our last meeting, on that very beach, nothing in this world will separate us." A week later, his unit was betrayed. An ambush during a patrol. Thomas, the radio operator, disappeared. He was listed as missing in action, presumed dead. She heard the shots echoing off the coast, her heart frozen with terror. No one ever found his body. For years, she waited. The war ended, the world celebrated, but she waited. Eventually, she had to accept it. She married, built a life, but kept Thomas locked away in the innermost sanctuary of her soul. She finally stopped talking. The studio was deathly silent. Adam was pale, shocked, processing his own family's history through the eyes of a stranger. Clara turned, finally seeing Adam again. She took his hand, the ink-stained hand, and held it with surprising strength. "I didn't understand what I felt for you, Adam," she said, her voice now firm with the sheer force of revelation. "I didn't understand this confusion, this attraction. It wasn't the passion of a crazy old woman, as this town thinks. It was my soul recognizing his soul." She looked from his hand to his eyes, the same eyes from the photograph. "You don't just look like him," she said, the final, stunning truth settling between them. "You have his spirit, his focus on his art, his kindness. It's him. It's as if the universe, in its infinite mercy, is giving me the chance to look into his eyes one last time." "I didn't understand what I felt for you, Adam," Clara said, her voice firm with revelation. "It wasn't the passion of a crazy old woman, as the town thinks. It was my soul recognizing his. You don't just look like him. You have his spirit, your kindness, your focus on your art. It's him. It's as if the universe gave me the chance to look into your eyes one last time." The sensual scandal that the town of Carmel had concocted was, in fact, the echo of a tragic love, so powerful that its essence spanned generations. For Adam, it was the discovery of his roots, a legacy of courage that gave new meaning to his art. The story spread through Carmel, but this time not as a sordid rumor, but as a revered legend. The town's petty judgment turned to shame, and finally to admiration. Arthur finished the portrait. In a gesture of pure intuition, he framed it in a double frame. On one side, Clara's portrait, marked by time. On the other, the original photograph of Thomas, eternally young. "Now," she whispered as she saw him with a smile of absolute peace, "we are together again." Clara passed away in her sleep months later, with the double frame on her nightstand. Adam decided not to leave Carmel. He bought her house, preserving her roses as a shrine, and continued to paint, no longer just faces, but the hidden stories of the soul.